In the spring of 2009, in a county office that smelled of burnt coffee and toner, a man with 2 degrees in soil science told Marta Vance that the only honest thing to do with her land was to walk away from it. He had a map of the valley spread across the table, the dry wash that ran through her acres, marked in a pale tan, the color of nothing. And he tapped it twice with a capped pen and said the ground was a write-off. 14 years later, in the late summer of 2023, a single melon, grown out of that same pale Tanwan wash, sold at a specialty produce auction in the city. For more than that man had once estimated her. Entire harvest was worth in a year. This is the story of the years between those two numbers, and of a woman who had been told, in the polite and certain language of people who measure things for a living, that what she knew was not knowledge at all. Stay with this one. You may have a piece of ground in your own life that somebody with a clipboard once crossed off. Marta was 58 years old that spring, and she farmed 40 acres at the eastern edge of a desert valley in Riverside County, where the heat came early and stayed late, and the rain, when it came all at once or not at all. She was known for 2 things. She did not waste words, and she could read a creek bed the way other people read a newspaper. The wash cut a long, shallow scar through the middle of her 40 acres, dry 11 months of the year, sand and cracked silt and a scatter of pale stones, and it was on that scar that she grew the melons her grandmother had grown before her. In the same hills, from the same line of seed. To the county, it was a flood channel and a liability, a thing to be culverted or filled. To Marta, it was the best ground she owned, and she would have traded the other 36 acres for it before she would have given it up. There was a moment, that second year, at a Valley Growers meeting in the Grange Hall, when the difference between those two ways of seeing was said out loud in front of everyone. Someone had asked, half in jest, why the Vance place still grew melons in a ditch when the future was drip and trellis. Dale Pruitt, up front with the projector, had answered for her, not unkindly, the way you answer for a person you are trying to protect from embarrassment. A boutique liability, he had called it, to a room of nodding men. Charming, but you can't build a valley on charming. Marta had been in the back row. She had not stood up. She had driven home and written the date and the weather and that day's melon weights in the ledger, because the ledger did not care what a Grange Hall thought, and neither in the end did she. Let me tell you about the man who told her to quit. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he was 44 that year, an agronomist with the county extension office, a careful man with a soft voice and a habit of pushing his glasses up with one knuckle when he was about to say something he believed would be hard to hear. He was not a bad man. That has to be said early, because the easy version of this story makes him a fool, and he was not a fool. He had spent his whole working life helping farmers survive on numbers, and the numbers he trusted had never once lied to him in a way he could see. He had walked Marta's wash that morning in clean boots, taken soil cores in 3 places, and run the samples against the valley baselines. The wash drained too fast, he said. It held no measurable organic matter to speak of. It flooded without warning and dried like a brick. In the language of his profession, it was marginal at best, and marginal was a word that meant a polite kind of doomed. I know it was your grandmother's, he told her, sitting across that table, with the map between them, his voice gentle. And I respect that, I do. But farming on sentiment is a hobby, Marta. It's a hobby, and a hobby is a thing you can afford to lose. He slid the soil report across the table as he said it, 3 pages of columns. The organic matter figure circled in red where it sat near the bottom of every valley baseline he had. He had numbers for everything. He had a number for how fast the water moved through the wash, measured with a ring he had pressed into the silt. and filled and timed with his own. Watch, and the number was bad, and he was not wrong about the number. He simply believed the number was the whole of the thing. She did not argue with him. That was not her way. She had learned a long time ago that you do not win an argument against a man who has measured something. You only make him hold his ground harder, and she had no interest in his ground. She thanked him for his time. She folded the soil report into quarters along its own creases, the way you fold a thing you intend to keep rather than read, and she drove the long, straight road home with her dog Pepper riding shotgun. A brown, speckled cattle dog with one ear that never stood up, who put her chin on Marta's knee at every stop sign as if to ask whether they were all right. They were all right. When she got home, she did not throw the report away. She pulled open the second drawer of the kitchen desk, where a stack of tin boxes sat that had belonged to her grandmother Esme. Dented coffee tins, and a flat tea tin with a faded ship on the lid, each one full of seed, sorted by year. And she laid the folded report on top of them, like a thing being filed next to its own answer. Then she went out to look at the wash in the last of the light. The melons were not up yet. The ground was bare and cracked into plates, the size of a hand, pale and hard, and it looked to any reasonable eye exactly as dead as Dale Pruitt had said it was. Marta stood at the edge of it until the light was gone. She was not looking at the surface. She had never once in her life been looking at the surface. Let me tell you about Esme, because none of what came after makes sense without her. Esme Vance had come into that valley in 1947 with a husband, a second-hand truck with a cracked windshield, and a flour sack of melon seed she had carried up from a village in Sonora, where her own mother had grown them in a riverbed that flooded and dried the same way. She had been 19. The seed in that sack was the most valuable thing the family owned, worth more than the truck, though no bank on either side of the border would have given $1 against it. People in Sonora had grown melons in dry washes for longer than the state of California had been a state, and they had learned something the valley's irrigation engineers never had to learn, because the valley had canals and Sonora had only weather and patience, and the memory of which seed had survived the last hard year. Esme planted her first California crop in the wash because the wash was the only ground nobody else wanted, the only ground cheap enough for people who had arrived with a sack and a truck. The melons came up sweeter than anything the canal farms could grow. Sweet enough that the first buyer who tasted one accused her of soaking the fruit in syrup. She could never fully explain why they were sweet, not in words a buyer would credit, and so people decided it was luck or a trick or the particular madness of a woman who watered almost nothing and still expected a crop. She let them think it. Meanwhile, she kept seed from the best fruit every single year, the heaviest and the sweetest and the ones whose vines had hung on longest into the dry, slicing each candidate melon at the kitchen table and tasting it and weighing it on a hanging scale before she would let a single seed of it into next year's tin. She wrote what she did in a cloth ledger, in a small slanted hand, the date and the weather and the weight of the fruit, and which mother plant the seed had come from, a line for every melon she ever chose to breed forward. By the time she died, she had 61 years of that ledger. 3 tins of seed sorted by decade, and a granddaughter who had spent every summer of her childhood walking the wash a step behind her, learning to read the ground the way Esme read it, by the color of the cracks and the slope of the silt, and the places where the deep water came nearest the surface. Here is the mechanism, because the niche of this story is not magic, it is dirt. A dry creek bed in the desert is not dead ground. It is the place where every flood the valley ever had laid down its silt, fine and deep and layered, like the pages of a book, one thin band, for every wet year going back further than anyone alive could count. Dale Pruitt's soil cores had gone down 3 feet and found that the top of it was hard and poor. And they were right about the top. But beneath the cracked surface that fooled those chasson samples, there was a column of stored moisture that ran down further than a shovel could. Follow, recharged by the same floods that frightened the canal farmers. Water held in the fine silt, the way a sponge holds water against the air. The valley called that flooding a hazard. To the wash, it was the bank deposit of the whole year. Esme's melons were not bred for the canal. They were bred, year after year, generation after generation of seed saved by hand against a single pressure, to send a taproot straight down through the surface into that stored water, a route that on a canal farm would have been a waste of the plant's energy. And in the wash was the plant's entire life. And here is the part that turns the whole story. The part Rosa would later confirm with her own glass tool. Drought stress, applied the right way, is what makes a melon sweet. A plant that has to reach for its water cannot afford to make watery fruit, so it pulls sugar into the melon as a kind of stored survival, thickening the flesh, concentrating everything. A melon that ripens slow and dry, on a deep root packs that sugar far past anything a well-watered field can reach, because the well-watered plant has no reason to bother. The canal farms watered their melons, fat and bland, because water was cheap and yield was king, and a big, pale melon weighed more on the scale than a small, dense one. Esme's line had been selected for the exact opposite for 3/4 of a century, for the small, dense fruit on the working root, and the wash was not their handicap. Say it plainly, the wash was their whole reason for being. Marta planted that spring the way she always had by hand, the seed from the tin boxes that Esme had filled into the silt of the wash after the last flood risk had passed. She planted about 4 acres of the wash and let the dry margins of it rest. Cal Dorsey watched her do it from his side of the fence. Let me tell you about Cal, because the story is unfair to him if I do not, and the story refuses to be unfair to him. He was a few years younger than Marta, a good neighbor and a genuinely decent man who had pulled her truck out of the mud more than once and never mentioned it again. He had just borrowed against everything he owned, the house and the land and the equipment, to put in 80 acres of table. Grapes on a high-pressure drip system the extension office had helped him design down to the last emitter. Dale Pruitt had drawn up his irrigation schedule, personally. A beautiful document. Water delivered to each vine on a clock. Nothing wasted. Every drop accounted for. Cal's grapes were the future. Everyone agreed. A high-value crop on efficient water. Exactly the kind of operation the valley was telling itself it had to become to survive. He leaned on the fence that morning while Marta knelt in the silt pressing seed in by hand. And he told her kindly, with no edge in it at all, that she ought to think about grapes. "There's no money in melons," he said. "Not the way you grow them, by hand in a ditch. You're working twice as hard as me for 1/10 of the return, Marta. I've run the numbers." He had run the numbers, and the numbers were honest, and he was not wrong about the return. Not yet. He had a spreadsheet that proved every word of it, and the spreadsheet measured exactly what it knew how to measure, and nothing it did not. Marta brushed the silt off her knees and said she would think about it. She did not think about it. She watched him walk back to his clean trellises, and she went on pressing seed into the wash, one hill at a time, the way Esme had shown her, the way Esme's mother had shown Esme. Through that first summer, and the 3 that followed, the 2 operations ran side by side like a long, slow argument. Nobody was speaking out loud. Cal's grapes came in heavy and bright, and went to the packing shed by the truckload. And the checks came back, fat enough that he made his loan payments, and bought a second sprayer, and then a new truck a white one with his operations name on the door, that he washed every Sunday. From the road, his place looked like everything the county wanted a farm to be. The trellises ruled off straight as a ledger, the drip lines ticking water out drop by metered drop, a clean and modern and confident thing. Marta's wash looked like nothing. Her melons sprawled green and low across the silt, untrellised, unsprayed, watered maybe twice a month, from a single old line she dragged out by hand. And she sold them out of a plank stand at the county road and to a handful of restaurants 2 hours west, who had learned quietly that a Vance melon was a different thing than a melon. She did not advertise. A chef in the city had found her stand by accident one August and bought every melon on the plank and driven back the next week for more. And that was the whole of her marketing, one man telling another. She kept her grandmother's ledger going in her own hand now, the weights and the weather and the mother plants, slicing and tasting and weighing. At the kitchen table, the way Esme had, and she kept saving the best seed every year into the dented tins, and she kept her debts at zero. Esme had taught her that with a single sentence, sitting at same table when Marta was a girl, a farm with no note on it could outlast a year, that a farm with a note could not, because the dry year does not care how good your plan was. It only asks who you owe. The county extension newsletter ran a feature that second year on the valley's most promising young operations, with a photograph of Cal grinning beside his trellises, and Marta's wash was not in it. Dale Pruitt wrote that feature himself. He sent her a copy in the mail, with a kind note, meaning no harm at all. Then Marta's niece came home. Rosa Vance was 24, with a degree in agricultural business from a state university and a job offer from a produce marketing firm. She had not yet accepted. She came to spend a season on the farm, the way you come to say goodbye to a thing you love and have decided is finished. She loved her aunt. She was also quietly a little ashamed of the wash. She had sat through 4 years of lectures on yield per acre and water use efficiency and supply, chain margin, and everything she had been taught told her that her aunt was a sweet, stubborn woman growing fruit in a ditch, because her grandmother, Rosa said as much gently one evening on the porch, with Pepper asleep between their chairs. "I just don't want you to lose the place because you wouldn't change," she said. "Cal's doing everything right, and he's barely making it. You're doing everything the hard way." Marta did not answer that with an argument. She handed Rosa the ledger. "Let me tell you what was in that ledger, because it is the thing that turned Rosa, slowly, over a whole season. It was not sentiment. It was data. 61 years of it, kept by a woman who never finished grade school, but who understood, without ever being told, that the only honest test of a method is time. Rosa, who had been trained to respect data above all things, started reading it the way she would read a problem set, looking for the flaw, because there is always a flaw, and finding it is what a degree teaches you to do. She did not find one. She found instead a record of selection so patient and so consistent that it stopped her cold somewhere around the 3rd decade of entries. Esme had been running an unbroken breeding program for over half a century in a closed environment against a single brutal and unchanging selection pressure, choosing forward only the fruit that survived the dry on the deep root and tasted of it, and the melons sprawling in the wash outside the window were the compounding result of every one of those choices. Rosa ordered a cheap refractometer off the internet, a little glass tool you put a drop of juice on and hold to the light to read the dissolved sugar, the same number the produce trade lives and dies by. She took it out to the wash on a hot, still morning and squeezed a drop from a melon and held it. Up the reading was so high, she assumed the tool was broken and ordered a second one from a different seller. It came 4 days later. It read the same. There it was, the first flicker of doubt, about her own doubt. Kneeling in the silt in July, with melon juice drying on her thumb and a number floating in the little glass window that 4 years of lectures could not explain away. She did not say anything to her aunt that day, but she started carrying the refractometer everywhere. And by August, she was the one asking which mother plant a given fruit had come from, and writing the answer in the ledger, in a hand that was learning, line by line, to slant the way Esme's had. By the end of the season, she had called the marketing firm and turned down the job. She told Marta about it on the porch, expecting to be talked out of it. And Marta only nodded and said the wash could use the second pair of hands. Which brings us back to the weather. Because the weather is what settled an argument none of them could settle with words. The drought came hard in 2014 and never fully let go. And by the early 2020s, the valley's water had become the only thing anyone talked about. The aquifer under the canal system had been overdrawn for decades, and when the state finally moved to meter and cap groundwater pumping, the farms that had built themselves on cheap, abundant water found the ground shifting under them all at once. Allocations were cut. Then they were cut again. The price of water that was still available climbed past anything Cal had budgeted. For when he signed his note, and his 80 acres of grapes, engineered for a world of cheap water that no longer existed, began to drink money faster than they made it. Dale Pruitt, to his credit, was out among the farms through all of it, sitting at kitchen tables he was no longer welcome at, helping people run the brutal new arithmetic of a valley that had run out of cheap water. He had aged in those years. He came to Marta's table, too, in the spring of 2022, grayer and quieter, and he set his clipboard down, and then, after a moment, set it on the floor instead, as if he had begun to understand it was not helping. He looked out the window at her wash, which, after 13 years of being told it was worthless, looked exactly the same as it always had, green and low and barely watered, untouched by the catastrophe, drowning everyone else, and he could not make it fit anything he knew. He turned the soil figures over in his head out loud, the drainage rate, the organic matter, all the numbers that said the ground should be dying with the rest, and none of them moved. It's an anomaly, he said at last, almost to himself, pushing his glasses up with one knuckle, the way he always had. You understand that, don't you? What you've got out there is an anomaly. It doesn't scale, and it can't be recommended to anyone. He meant it as a kindness, even now. He was telling her, in the only language his profession had given him, that what worked for her could not be a real answer, because in his world a real answer was a thing that worked everywhere, or it did not count as knowledge at all. He could not yet imagine a kind of knowing that belonged to one place and was true. Marta poured him more coffee and let the words sit in the room between them. That was the second time the label had been laid on the wash, in a different register than the first, worried now, instead of certain. And like the first time, she did not argue with it. She had learned that the ground would do the arguing. The ground was already doing it, out the window, in green, and he had not yet learned how to read the reply. By then, the failures had begun in earnest around them. Cal cut half his grapes loose that summer because he could not afford to water them, walking the lines himself and shutting the valves one block at a time. And the dead vines stood brown on their trellises all down the eastern road, 80 acres of efficient agriculture that one good assumption about cheap water had turned into kindling. He lost 40 of his 80 acres outright. He had spent, by his own accounting, at the kitchen table. One bad night, the better part of $300,000 on a system built for a world that no longer existed, and he could not run from it because the note did not care. The county average yield on table grapes fell by roughly a third in 2 years. 3 operations Rosa had studied as models in her coursework, held up to her as the future of the valley, went under entirely and sold their equipment at auction. Marta's wash, through all of it, gave the same 4 acres of melons it always had. On a fraction of the water, Cal's dead vines had drunk, because the melons had never depended for one day on the water that was gone. Off those 4 acres in 2022, she pulled just over 900 fruit, on roughly a tenth of the water per acre that the grapes had needed. Set the two numbers side by side, and the whole argument is in them. Cal lost 40 acres and $300,000 to the drought. Marta lost nothing, because she had spent 14 years being told she had nothing to lose. To the bank, a melon was a low-margin commodity, not worth metering. To the restaurants 2 hours west, it had become, almost overnight, the most prized fruit in the state. Because scarcity and a structural shock had finally taught the wider world to taste what Esme had been breeding. For since a flour sack came up from Sonora in 1947. Let me tell you about the day the verdict came in, because it came from a stranger who owed Marta nothing, and had every reason to talk the price down. A produce buyer named Wend drove out from the city in the late summer of 2023, a senior buyer, for a market that supplied the best restaurants in 3 counties, a heavy-set patient man who tasted fruit for a living and had a reputation up and down the trade for never paying a nickel he did not have to and never apologizing for it. Rosa had sent him a single melon in a plain box with no note and no price, only the sugar reading, written on the lid in pencil. He had called the number on the shipping label and asked flatly whether the reading was a typo. It was not. He came out to see the ground himself, which Rosa would later say he had never once done for any other grower. He stood at the edge of the wash with Marta and Rosa, and Pepper lay in the shade of the truck, gray in the muzzle now and slow to get up, watching them with her chin on her paws. Went cut a melon open with his own knife, a folding knife he carried for exactly this, and he ate a piece of it standing in the silt, and then he ate a second piece. And he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the cracked pale ground and the low green vines, and he did not say what everyone always said, which was that it could not be growing anything. He had just tasted what it was growing. Then he asked the only question that mattered, the question that proved he understood the place better in one afternoon than the county had in 14 years. "How many of these can you grow?" he said, and never one more than that. It was exactly right. It was the only question that understood the wash was a fixed and finite thing, that its worth was bound to its limits, that you could not ask it for more without turning it into something it was not. Marta told him. "About 900 a year," she said, "maybe 1,000 in a good year, and not one fruit more. Because the wash was the wash, and you could not make it bigger without making it ordinary." Went nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has just been told a price, and found, to his own surprise, that he thinks it is fair. He did not negotiate. He named a wholesale figure per melon, and Rosa, standing beside him, put her hand flat on the warm metal of the truck to steady herself. $41. $41 a melon. Wholesale for fruit grown on ground a soil scientist had circled in red and crossed off a map, and then Wend asked for one thing more. He wanted a single fruit for a specialty auction in the city, the kind of auction where the best buyers in the state bid against each other to set the season's market for a rare thing, and he wanted the best melon of the year. Marta gave him the heaviest fruit of that crop, the one she had already marked in the ledger as the season's mother plant, and she watched it go into his box the way you watch a child leave for somewhere far. He entered it into the auction among people who knew rare things when they tasted them. It sold for $920. One melon. The number landed with a force all out of proportion to its size, because it was never really about one melon at all. It was the whole argument. 14 years of it, the soil report, and the hobby, and the anomaly, and the dead vines down the eastern road, settled in a single printed line on an auction sheet that anyone could read. Rosa read it off her phone at the kitchen table that night, and set the phone down face up, and did not say anything for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Pepper's tail thumped once against the floorboards, the way it did when she felt a thing change in the room, without knowing what. Nobody spoke. Outside the window, the wash lay in the dark, exactly as it had the evening Dale Pruitt told Marta to walk away from it, the same dead-looking ground, the same low vines, and it had not changed by a single grain, and everything around it had changed completely. Word got back to Dale before the season was out, the way word does in a valley, where everyone buys diesel at the same two places. He came to the farm one more time in the fall, and this time he did not bring his soil kit. He stood at the wash for a long while, with his hands in his pockets, an older man now, grayer at the temple than the one who had tapped the map with a pen, looking at 4 acres of ground he had once measured and condemned. "I cored it 3 feet down," he said finally, not turning around. "That spring, 3 feet, in 3 places by the book. I never went deeper." There was no reason in the book to go deeper. He was not making an excuse, and Marta could hear that he was not. He was an honest man doing the hardest thing an honest man is ever asked to do, which is to say out loud, in front of the person he was wrong about, that the instrument he had trusted his whole working life had been pointed the wrong way the whole time. He had measured the surface perfectly. He had simply never been taught that the surface was not the question. "Would you teach me?" he asked, and now he did turn around. "What I should have been measuring." Marta did not gloat. There was nothing in her that wanted to. She took the ledger off the desk and laid it open on the kitchen table in front of him, 60-some years of a woman's slanted hand, the weights and the weather and the mother plants, and she pulled out a chair and let him read it, the way she had let Rosa read it, in silence, at his own pace, until the size of the thing came up through the pages and took him. That was the conversion, and it cost him nothing he could not afford to lose, and it gave him the only thing the place had ever had to give, which was the plain truth about how it worked. What happened after is the part Esme would have cared about most, more than the auction, more than the $41. Marta did not scale up. She turned down 2 investors who came out from the city within a month of each other, both with the same idea, which was to plant heritage melons in dry washes all over the state and sell shares in it. She told them no at the same kitchen table, because she knew, the way her grandmother had known in her bones, that the melons were the marriage of one particular line of hand-saved seed to one particular piece of ground that had been reading that seed for 75 years. And you could not franchise that any more than you could franchise the weather or a grandmother. What she did instead was give the seed away. She taught the neighbors who came back to her now, the ones who had lost grapes and almonds, and were looking at the dry washes on their own land with entirely new eyes. And she sold them seed at a fair and ordinary price, and showed them how to read their own ground, and how to start their own ledgers in their own hands. Cal was the first one through the gate. He put his ruined low ground, the part of his place that had always flooded, and that he had cursed for years, into Esme's melons on a handshake and a tin of seed. And Marta walked his wash with him and showed him where the deep water came nearest. And within 3 seasons he had paid back what the dead grapes had cost him and kept his land. Rosa took over the master ledger in her own hand, the 4th keeper of it, the first with a degree, and she and Marta together wrote down the method in plain language. the deep-root dryland selection that Esme had carried up from Sonora in a flour sack, and that the canal age had very nearly let die in a single generation so that it could never again be lost to one bad year, or one closed mind, or one capped pen on a map. Dale Pruitt cited the wash in a paper the following year, not as an anomaly now, but as a case of something his whole profession had failed to know how to see. And he sent Marta the first copy. The valley is changing, slowly, the way real things change. And there are dry washes greening up all down the eastern road that 10 years ago were nothing but tan on a county survey. Here is the thing the whole story comes down to, and I will say it plainly. There are two kinds of knowing in this world. There is the kind that is wide and fast and confident, that measures what is easy to measure and trusts the number it gets. And there is the kind that is narrow and slow and patient, that lives in one place for 60 years and learns what no instrument, 3 feet down, will ever find. The first kind built the canals and the spreadsheets and the 80 acres of grapes that died in a year. The second kind kept a flour sack of seed alive across a border, and 3 generations, and one soy scientist's polite certainty that it was worthless. What is rigid breaks when the weather turns, and what has learned to bend toward the deep water endures. The system measured the wash and saw nothing. Esme measured it for a lifetime and saw everything. And she was right. And being right took only as long as the drought took to prove it. Marta is older now, and most evenings she sits on the porch in the last of the light, with the ledger closed on her knee, the dog gray and slow at her boot, and she watches the wash go dark, the same dead ground, the same green low vines, the best 40 acres she ever owned, and the only 4 that ever mattered. Pepper sighs and settles. The water is down there where it always was. You just have to know how to reach it.